Chapter 12, Benefits and Characteristics of Graphics. It's certainly very useful to have graphics to be able to demonstrate information, whether it's a numerical table or it's a logical relationship like an organization chart. Maybe it's the size differences between two things that helps, or it's something like communicating the steps in a process. I always think back of when you used to be able to buy a PC. I'm just using a new one now, and there was a big instruction booklet of how to get everything going. Of course, now we don't have that issue as much, but at one point before USB came along, you had so many different cords. You had to plug in the printer cord, which is pretty easy to define because the LPT1 was so large. But then you had one plug to plug in the mic, another one to plug in the speaker, another one to plug in the keyboard, and etc., etc. And so what the PC manufacturers quickly realized is it would be much better to do this as a color coding. So they would literally standardize on a color code for all the PCs so that you could mix and match between different PCs and keyboards and plug them in. So I think that was a very useful thing for us to get to. Here's another example of how graphics can help in a step-by-step process. Hopefully you can see this, but the idea here is to have a list of things that you need to go through. And this one happens to be a list from the USA Triathlon Association of what you need to take to a triathlon. And if you think of a swim, bike, run, it's pretty easy to forget something. And I've started at the top of my head for a bike. I can work down from there into the different parts, including making sure I remember my bike. How about my swimming? Okay, I got my wetsuit, I got my cap, I have got my goggles, I've got my trunks, all those sort of things that you need to go through. And so my example here of how important a little list like I just showed you can work to your advantage is I went to one of my early triathlons after working out for about a year and got out of the swim, heart beating maybe 150 beats per minute, full speed. My buddy asked me to help him with his gear, so it really got me anxious on my time. And as soon as I fixed his problem, he said, "Thanks, bye," and off he went. Drove me crazy. So I went over to my bike to jump on it and chase him down and beat him on the road, and I had no helmet. It was half a mile away. So there's an example where, just a list can make a big difference that's organized by different pictures, for instance. So that helps. Here's another one, and I would say the books nowadays are far easier to read than when I first went to school. And I think the book that really made the difference was the Dummies book, and you can see the different things that the Dummies book uses. For instance, at the bottom here they've got a warning with looks like a little bomb on it. They've got a remember at the top with a tie around your finger. And I think the Dummies really popularized how we could improve text. And you can argue that your text is still pretty bad, and there's certainly better ones, but there's also worse one. Here's another one that I also like. It's the Head First series. And again, just the first one I showed you with Dummies was on Java. This one's on C#, and it's just very good graphics and tying things together with a little bit of humor as well mixed in. This one's called Kathleen's Test Drive. So all those sort of things make it easier to get the message across. What's one more? Oh, here we go. Here's another one I haven't used for a while. When I decided to do an Ironman, I realized that as much as I'd swum as a teenager and swum well, compared to this level of starting off a race with 2.6 miles, that I could probably improve on my swimming. So I signed up for a weekend swim instruction. It was all high-end very expensive. And lo and behold, it was the first time I was on San Jose campus, and I was actually at the Pool Aquatic Center there. So let me pull that here. So it starts on the left with here's the explanation of what it is, and on the right it shows you pictures of the little techniques that they're using for the swimming. So it's all on plastic. I would take it to my pool, put it on the side, and practice length after length. Flip over to the next page. There's, let's see, there's 14 pages, very well organized, and you went through the stroke series. So that's another example of how you can use graphics to get across a message. Imagine trying to explain how to change your stroke to people. It's very, very difficult. And if you're like me, and maybe you are with your writing, I know as much as I tried with my swimming, I would tend to do the same thing wrong and again. I'm surprised that my coach didn't yell at me more. So there's some examples of how it can offer a benefit to you in getting across the message, whether it's international users or even local users. Now I'll go back and I'll point out an item I mentioned in the first part of this chapter, of how in the first example that you can see in Canvas, I had an environmental PowerPoint, and then the second one was a PowerPoint for an international reader, and then the third one was back to a local audience, but because I'd gone through the enhancement with an international audience, it was now better quality because I'd used some of the graphics that I'd been forced to use by having a non-native speaking audience to present to. I had I've been a member of the Executives Association of San Francisco for a number of years, and there's an architect on there that's LEED certified. He's a friend, and he presented on what LEED was. And LEED is it started off in California, if you don't know, and it is to address the waste that we have in building, which happens to be the biggest waste that we have in North America. And I remember him presenting at the front in a beautiful hotel in San Francisco for our weekly lunch meeting, and he quoted all of these numbers. So energy reduction 30 to 50%, carbon emissions 30%, and you could just imagine someone standing there and you're in the audience listening immediately after lunch, and you're pretty well falling asleep. In fact, we had one member that would fall asleep regularly on us. And so because he was so well qualified and he really knew his stuff, I said, could you present to one of my environmental classes at San Jose State? And of course he was delighted to help out, but I made the proviso that he had to do PowerPoint. And he came up with this slide, and the PowerPoint deck is an outstanding one. He really did a good job on it. And then when he came and presented, I made sure that it was of good quality, didn't have to poke him at all on it. He really did an outstanding job on his own. And then he came to present, and he sat on the chair at the front and again presented in a monotone voice. So much for graphics. You got to have a little more than that to really get the message across. So a little bit about benefits. Now let's talk about characteristics of an effective graphic. It should serve a purpose. And what I mean by that is I see people that, they've got a PowerPoint presentation. They have a number of things that they're talking about. It's all in Word, and they go, we've had 3 slides of Word. We should throw in a graphic. Oh, here's an icon. Let's just throw in an icon or something like that. Don't do that. Everyone should have a purpose. And the other thing is, you can get beyond the simple and make it so complicated that, in fact, it diffuses the message. So make sure that you don't pick complicated slides. Make them as manageable as possible in the amount of information that you're trying to pass on. And also, there are different expectations. So, for instance, an XY address, where you write what's on the y-axis, for instance, is on the left-hand side, typically not on the right side. And yes, you should clearly label the graphics. So let's move on to the next slide, talking a little bit about honest graphics. Make sure that if you do use a source that you obtain their permission and include all the data. It's very easy to hide data in graphics. In fact, I remember a book I read in the 80s was How to Lie with Statistics. And one of the ways to lie with statistics is not to begin your graph at zero origin for the X and Y axis. Sometimes you can't, but make sure you're clear on that, because you can easily mislead someone if you don't do that. So don't try and hide a data point in real world. Sometimes there's data points you just can't explain. And so, go through that. Don't overuse color. And let me show you an example, because you're probably saying, well, who would lie with graphics? So let me show you how I can lie to you with graphics. Here's some workout weeks that I ran, 24-week period, for doing bicycling as I started training for my race around Lake Tahoe. And you can see it has its ups and downs, but generally there's a good upward trend. And so that's the message. You can tell I have a fair bit of statistics on this. If you want to know the elevation by week, I can give you that, the elevation per ride, the miles per ride. I have data after data on this. Now, let me give you a couple weeks before and some weeks afterwards. Take a look. Here's week 3. I didn't ride at all. And here's week, whatever it is, 27, 28. What a disaster this week was. And so watch out for this sort of information misleading you, because it can be having the extra things at the left and right can make a big difference. And I confess, the ones that are at 0 are the ones where this course got out of control and I was backed up on grading, and I had to make that my highest priority. So this is where my biking and my health suffers. Here's another example of honest graphics on the left-hand side. Oh, look, 3D. Hey, this is a new feature. I remember this feature when it came out. Let's click and use it. Turns out very difficult to tell which is the highest. Even with the numbers on, you kind of lose it. Whereas opposed to on the right, you can actually see, oh, okay, the middle one is indeed the lowest one between the two, and we've got a little more information there. So that's some examples of how you can lie with statistics. Here's one more in case you didn't believe me. Housing starts, and you notice as well as going up in the graph, it's also creating the volume, and so it creates this illusion where this is certainly not twice the size of this. It's a multiple because of volume rather than just height being expanded. So that can be misleading. I spoke a bit about too much information. So TMI, this is some information about a railroad line. And what you need to do is you need to figure out, so what's important? Is it the lines itself? Is it the months of data? Is it where is the problem because it's electrical or other? And work across to decide which ones you need to use and what best fits for the message you're trying to get across. So a very key thing to watch out for. Let's now focus on your final report. You need to have some guidelines on how to handle this, and so here's what I expect for you to do for from now on, and especially for your final report. So before you have a graphic in a text, you need to introduce it. You need to explain what it is, and then you place the graphic after the point that you've introduced it. Make sure it's clear. By making it accessible, give the source of where it is. And I remember publishing a paper where I had 2 or 3 graphs in one page. I read the rules for that publication and said you can only have one, and I was pulling my hair out because I really needed a couple together. And now here I am on the other side telling you it's probably a good idea. As much as I didn't like it at the time, you should focus on no more than 1 graph per page, just like you should have no more than 1 set of bullet points in the page. Some of you in an earlier assignment had 2 and as many as 3 sets of bullet points on a 1-page assignment. And too much of a good thing just doesn't work. So now let's talk about the two ways that you focus on these. One is defining it as a table or as a figure. What's a table? Think of Excel. If it looks like an Excel spreadsheet, it's probably a table, whereas a figure is anything else. Include the title of what it is. Maybe I typically put that at the top, although some publications do it differently, and at the bottom I put the source. And then, I count them out. So we've got, in this example, we've had figures 1, 2, and 3. And it turns out the next one is a table. So it's table 1, and then you go to figure 4 and 5, and then you go to table 2. It sounds a little confusing, but I wanted to show you this as an example so that you knew that these things are tracked differently. What's a table look like? This one's got a bit of both. And you could argue it's a figure rather than a table. I've decided this is a table. It's a good fit, and let's just take a look. I'll scroll down a little bit here, and it's a Bank of America Merrill Lynch Global Research article, and the topic is big data. So that's how the stack war. And here's figure 1, which is obviously doesn't look like an Excel spreadsheet. The 5 technology catalysts for growth. And I'm doing something that I'd never do when I was presenting in a class. And notice I have red with a blue background. That is a disaster. So watch out for that, because it's so hard to read the red. And yesterday in a class, I had to correct a student because he done that very thing. And of course, doesn't have a problem when we're looking at it in on our PCs, but when you put it up in a projector, it makes a big difference. So let's stop here, and we'll move on to the third section of this chapter.